Hey everyone, welcome to Python the Right Way, episode 1. I'll be your teacher. My name's Ian. I'm a data science student in my 4th year at university. I wanted to make this little video series to kind of teach the basics of Python and really learn it in a way that I think is really helpful for if you want to um, use Python practically. So this approach to Python might not be as in depth as some approaches are, but I think using what I'm going to teach you in these next few episodes, you'll be able to do a lot of really cool stuff. Whether you're a student getting into something like computer science, or if you're just an average person who wants to maybe think about automating some of your work life, that's very easy to do with Python, and I'll show you how to do it. So let's start here. I'll be making an episode 0 later on to show how to set up and set up Python, set up the environment, set up a code editor like this, and also talk about kind of the fundamentals of Python, how it works, what it is. But for right now, we're just going to assume that you have a development environment like this. I'm using VS Code, and I'm on Linux, but this is all pretty easy to set up on Windows. I'll make a tutorial about it later. But yeah, so what I'm assuming is that you have your development environment and you can get it to run Python code. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do that. The easiest way is if you're in VS Code, you go to File, Preferences, Keyboard Shortcut. So you open up your keyboard shortcuts, you type in run into the search bar here, and you go down to Python run Python file. Set that key binding to Shift plus Enter, and now whenever you want to run Python, all you have to do is press Shift and Enter, and you'll run the file that you're in. Now, it's possible that when you try and do this, you'll get an error that looks something like this. If that happens, all you have to do is type the word exit with parentheses. And the reason why that is because when you first change that shortcut, it might think that you're in Python here in the drop-down terminal. But by exiting, you exit Python and you change it so that running the file now runs the file. And you don't have to understand all of that. I'll explain all of that later on. But for now, all you need to know is that we're in a development environment. We can write Python code up here, and we can run it in our terminal down here. So to just kind of get the very first steps with Python, so what is Python? Python is a programming language. And what that means is it's basically a way of giving the computer instructions to do things. So usually the first example that every computer class goes over for programming is doing something called Hello World, which is we're just going to get the terminal to display Hello World. And so the way that we're going to do that in Python is we're going to do print, open parentheses, in quotes, we're going to put hello world. And then we're going to save the file, Control S to do that. And then we're going to Shift and Enter, like I showed you. And you can see that ran the Python file, and we get our output, hello world. So that's what this print function right here, okay, we'll get into functions later on. That's what this print function does. It writes to the terminal the what's called a string that we put into here, and that's a great segue into our next section. Variables. Probably everyone remembers variables from math class. When you were a kid, you had variables like x or y or z or q or p or K, anything like that. And so in Python, we have variables too. And what do variables represent in math class where it's X or Y or Z? Well, they represent things like in math class numbers. So what a variable is it's basically setting a name equal to something else. So like X equals 3, right? If we take X and we print X like that, we'll see down here 3. Okay, so we're gonna go over a couple of types of variables, a couple of different types that variables can be. So first, what we're gonna do, just so we don't have so much clutter down here, we're gonna comment this out, and we're gonna do that by adding a hashtag to the start of the line. That turns it into a comment. What that basically means is that, hey, Python is going to ignore this, and it's going to only execute the things without a hashtag in front of it. So let's comment these out, and let's talk about the different data types that a variable can be. So our first variable data type that we'll look at is a string. And what is a string? Well, a string is something like hello world. Okay, so hello world, that's a string. So if we set X equal, or actually let's, because it doesn't have to just be one letter like X or Y, it can be something like message equals hello world, and then we print the message, right? Save that, hello world, right? So yeah, that's a string. A string is just a collection of variables, or sorry, a collection of characters like H. This is also a string. And I'll show you how to verify this. What we can do is we can go inside of this print statement, we can write type. And what type does is it tells us the type of the variable that you're putting into it. This is very important. I'll keep talking about this a lot. Type is one of your most useful tools when it comes to figuring out why or why not Python is behaving in a certain way. So let's see what it prints for the type of message. It prints str, or str, that means string. So what's another type of data type that a variable can have? Well, another one is called an integer, and that basically means a whole number. So like 3. If we print I here, we can see 3. And if we print the type of I, we can see integer. Let's move on. The next type of variable is a float. So what is a float? A float refers to a floating point number, which basically means any number that has a decimal in it. So like pi, 3.1415, right? So why is this called a float? Well, there's some pretty complex reasons behind it, but one way that you can remember this is you can think that the floating point is this period right here, this decimal point. This decimal point can be anywhere in the number, and it will create a float, right? So if we put 31.415 and we print that, well, we have to set it equal to a variable first. So number equals 31.415, and we print number, and we run that, 31.45. Now type of number, you can see that it's a float. And so now let's talk about combining variables, right? Because a lot of the time, most of what we're gonna do in computer science or when programming with Python will involve some kind of, operations. We're adding numbers, we're subtracting numbers, we're using them to do a lot of different things. So how is adding integers? Well, we can go up here, we can uncomment X, and we can see that. So we're going to add X plus, because remember, X is equal to 3, and I is equal to 3. So we should get 6, right? Let's run this. That's weird. Why don't we see 6? Well, it's because in order to get something to happen down here, we need to do more than just tell Python to do it. Because down here, Python is showing its output, right? Every Python file generates an output. So specifically what we're looking at here is the text output. And the way that you make Python create text output is by using this print function right here. So we have to go back and we have to write the print function. So now we run this. There we go, 6. So what we can also do is, we did that, but we can also do like m equals x plus I. And then instead of printing x plus I, we can just print m. And you can see if we look at the type of m, it's an integer. Alright, so we've looked at adding integers together. What about if we add a float plus a integer? Well, let's check that out. So let's change it from m equals x plus I to m equals x plus number, right? Because number is 31.415. It's a float. So let's print this number. And it is 34.415, which is 31.415 plus 3. That's what we expected. But what data type is this? You should make a guess down in the comments. Let's see. Is it an integer or is it a float? It's a float. And why is it a float? Well, it's a float because when we added the floating point number to the integer, we necessarily introduced this decimal point right here. So having this decimal point makes it a float. So now let's look at how does adding strings together work? So we put message, and then let's make another variable called response. So equals hello. And so let's do letter, because let's say we're writing a letter, equals message plus response. And then we print the letter. Hello. See that? How it added the H from above in message to hello in response. And you can see that there's no spaces between those. And that's because there's no spaces in the strings that we made. So if we add a space here, then we'll see, and we run it, then there's a space there. So it won't just add strings for you like this. We'll talk about something in just a second that will add spaces, but we'll get to that. So let's just cancel this out for a second. Now let's change this to test equals message plus, but instead of response, let's do an integer. Let's do x. So what happens if you try to add a integer and a string? We're gonna get an error, right? Certain data types can only be added together certain ways. So, when you add two strings, you push them together. It's like you add one word after another. And when you add two numbers, it's like you just sum the numbers together. But when you try to add a string and a number, it doesn't really make sense what that's going to turn out. So you're going to get an error like this. And there are a lot of circumstances where this can happen in Python. In fact, I would dare say that this was the cause of the majority of the errors that I got when I first started with Python, was not understanding that data types, the type of data type that you have is incredibly important. So going forward, just try and be always conscious of whenever you're working with a variable, just always try and keep in your mind, what kind of data type is it? Because that's going to tell you what you can do with it, what kind of things it does, and it's going to be really helpful for some of the more advanced concepts later on. So we saw that integer and string doesn't work. So let's talk about just one more thing, which is string concatenation. So remember how earlier we had message and response returned hello because there were no spaces. Well, what if instead of a space we do this? Actually, does this work? Yeah. Oh, no. Never mind. Don't look at that. We're going to do message, comma, response. What's this going to do? It's going to print hello again, but instead of like the space, or instead of how it would be with a plus sign, if we have this comma, then we get a space in between. So this is called string concatenation. And the really cool thing about it is that it also allows you to mix strings and integers. So, or integers or floats. So we try this, we get H space 3. So this is just a shorthand in Python. You can do this inside of any print function. You can concatenate values of more or less any kind by adding a comma, and it will treat it like it's a string, and with a space separating it, and it will let you add values together in one print on the terminal. So we can also see we can do it with something like this. It'll tell us H and then the class. So last thing we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about functions. We're just going to kind of do a really quick introduction to functions. So we're going to comment all of this out, and we're going to go down here to functions. So we've already looked at probably the most important function in Python, which is the print function. That's what does things like hello world. So there are a number of built-in functions like print, and I'm just going to introduce you to some of the basics of them. So what we have in the parentheses of the functions of a function, we call this the arguments, or sometimes we also call it the parameters. And what that's saying is it's just telling us what is the function acting on. So print obviously causes the thing inside of it to be displayed to the terminal. So the arguments of print will be, what do you want it to display to the terminal? So it can be hello world, and then we add a comma, string concatenation like we just talked about, X, and we get hello world and 3, you know? So the arguments of print, we can say, are going to be the things you want printed, you know, separated by commas, or else with some kind of operation in there. What are some other built-in functions in Python? Well, we're going to look at one more. This one's called the len function. Okay, so what the len function does is it tells you the length of something. So like the length of this string. How many letters or how many characters are in hello world? Well, if we do this, we can see that it's 11, because the length of the hello world is equal to the integer 11. And when we print that, it prints 11. So what if we look at type? Type is another function that we've gotten a lot of experience with already. So we use type, we see that it's an integer. So we're going to look at just one more function, because so far all of these functions have only had one parameter. Well, some functions have more than one parameter. So what we're going to do is, this is a very common pattern in Python, that if you want to find out how many numbers are between, let's say we want to figure out how many numbers are there in between 137 and 936. Okay, so the way that we do this is we use something called the range function. And what the range function does is it returns what's called a range between two numbers. So our first parameter is going to be the number we want to start at, and our second parameter is going to be the number we want to end at. So you can imagine this will come in really handy for a lot of different things. Like if we want to get how many songs are in this playlist, well, we start with the range from the first song to the last song, and then we get the length, and then we print it. So we're going to do that, and we can see that there is a difference of 799 values. There are 799 values between 137 and 936. So just try and remember going forward those concepts of functions, parameters, outputs. What does the function create? So range creates something called a range between two numbers. Length, right here, len, creates an integer, and print creates an output to the terminal. So this outputs a terminal display, this outputs an integer, and this outputs a range. So yeah, that's pretty much everything for today. Drop any questions that you have down in the comments. I'll try to answer all of them. And have a great day.